Happy Lamster Dave. How are you doing?
Hello. I should say
Welcome.
Happy Easter. Christ has risen. So,
Yes, he is risen indeed. Um, and and my brain is almost shutting down at this point.
I
But
can totally imagine. I mean, it's been a long enough day for myself. We're at that sort of perfect age with my son where Easter egg hunts are kind of at the height of his mental capacity. He loves identifying colors and counting. Uh,
oh,
and,
nice.
but he hasn't yet figured out that we just take the same 10 or 20 eggs and rehide them. So we're kind of pulling off sort of a Federal Reserve operation so that my wife, we just have to have 10, 20 eggs, and I'll take from the bottom and then rehide them when he goes looks for the other ones.
He's,
So that,
when he
yeah.
realizes he's going to start demanding some kind of fractional reserve egg collection.
Exactly. Yeah, he can count up to 20, so I don't think he can quite conceptualize the fact that he collected about 50 eggs, but there's only like 19 in the basket. Yeah. So
Some crazy magic trick.
yeah, but yeah, that's fun, and then obviously there was mass and everything. But yeah, I'm really glad to be doing this. I haven't gotten quite through the catalog of the Lamster streams, but it's been going very well.
It's quite extensive at this point, but yes, I've been very pleased, and there's a lot of variety in there, and my guests have all been fantastic. So I couldn't be
Yeah,
more pleased with how it's all gone.
I think that it would be really interesting to experiment with different modes of doing this. Like I know that recently Millennial he's been experimenting with two or three guests. Obviously, you don't want to devolve into some kind of bread tube panel where you've got 24 people on the same stream, but it does. It does kind of if you're doing these in sequentially,
Yeah,
sometimes a small panel can be effective. You
I
know,
thought of that actually, and doing the baton pass where you have every guest talks to the guest that's before and after them, and so you always have a period with it's just me and the guest, and then the crossover. I thought that might be quite interesting.
a series of three, and then you keep on phasing in and phasing out. That'd be interesting.
Yeah. So maybe next year it'll be me doing some sort of 24-hour non-stop broadcast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what we were going to talk about today was the myth of secularism. I know we were talking about this a bit off camera, but we were also kind of speculating as to the future of the online movement for dissidents, for non-progressive dissidents from the non-left wing,
Yep.
aka the right wing. And I do think that the topics are a little bit connected, obviously.
Hmm.
This last week I've gone into a little bit of conflict with the centrists Adam and Sitch. People warned me not to do
Was
it, and I did it anyway. But
I was wondering if you were given that as penance for something that you did.
yeah, well, I mean, it kind of it predictably devolved into this conversation where I felt like they were kind of it would really behoove them not to understand what I was saying and constantly pretend like I wasn't answering the questions. And
Hmm.
the problem is that what I kind of want to communicate to, and I'm going to go over this probably in my own live stream this week, but I'm really there for the audience. And what I feel very distinctly is, it's not obviously not bad to like liberalism or to kind of prefer some of the fruits of secularism. But for my mind, it's very important to understand why liberalism is failing, because
Hmm.
it's it does point in the direction of trying to live an actual authentic life and build authentic community.
Hmm.
The reason why liberalism failed was that there was no undergirding ethos. The founding fathers imagined some combination of religion and ethnicity, and then during a period of, well, over the course of time, we kind of loosened the definitions around what that religion was in particular. Obviously, initially it's supposed to be some form of Protestantism. Then it was broadened to some kind of vague Christianity, broadened again to the incoherent Judeo-Christian,
Yeah.
before it kind of, and then it was kind of radically secularized and became even more confused. All the while, we built more of identity on basically outgrowths of our own wealth. And so now we're in a situation where now that our wealth is decreasing, now that growth is no longer meeting the breakneck speeds we want it to. We're discovering that there's really nothing that holds any of us together at a principled level. And in this condition, liberalism can't work because there's nothing that commands loyalty from any of the parties. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the problem. It's important for, I think, the centrists to understand this. And they reframe this like, I'm not providing them with some alternative. Like, I'm not providing them, and I'll provide alternatives. I'll provide things, but what they need to understand is this thing that you're constantly complaining about not existing. It can't possibly exist in the culture we've created. And so complaining about it not existing is just sort of futile and childish.
I think this is a very core issue for a lot of people, that we can change our minds about surface level beliefs, but when you strike somebody right to the center of what they believe, you're asking them to make potentially seismic changes in their life to other things that they believe and activities that they take part in. So that's at some point it becomes not a rational question, I think, but a decision about, can I face the truth, or am I going to continue to run and hide from what's staring me in the face?
I mean, just think about the whole what we've experienced in the last 2 years. This is very much an American thing, but everyone knows that the red state America has been becoming more secular in the last 20 years. And there's a certain red state American who constantly goes on about America and freedom. Does anyone really believe that anymore after 2 years of COVID lockdowns? I mean, I don't know. What freedom do we have that they can't take away from us? I remember very distinctly the moment where I kind of realized this, that, even though I wasn't psychologically going along with the lockdown, that it was still like it was still controlling my life, was in 2020 over the summer. I wanted to take my son to the beach. And this was, of course, after the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests had gone on, and they burned down, sections of Portland and Seattle, and huge crowds of people packed shoulder to shoulder, but they're wearing masks, or some of them weren't. This is in August, and the governor just closed all the beaches. Like, he closed all the roads to get to the beaches. So you can't take your kid to a partially abandoned, cold Northern California beach, and that's a free country, right? Like, how are you free? You're completely at the whims of the government and its own biases at that stage. And so a lot of this whole American pride over we are the free people, it's sort of this bullshit that came out of, well, really the Reagan administration. I don't think anyone really talks that way anymore, or I can't take that seriously anymore.
I always wondered what it would be like to live in an extremely oppressive. Say you were a woman in Saudi Arabia and you were forced to constantly wear a full hijab, and you looked to other countries and thought their freedom is not true freedom. Like, I find true freedom in now you see the same exact thing with people wearing masks. In one state in America, looking at the other state where they're not wearing masks and saying that's not true freedom. The true freedom is that I want to wear this mask, and it's amazing that. Or another comparison I made is that all the superstition throughout history, where people go to the witch doctor and have some obviously made up chemical thing that some charms floated around your head or whatever, like that's going to cure you. But here we are, 2020, and people in the West buy just ludicrous, ridiculous things, but on pure trust. So It's kind of remarkable how I've actually seen recently the continuity of humanity, that we're still just as foolish and tribal as we ever were throughout history. Um, it's put the final nail in the coffin of any kind of kind of Hegelian progressive view of history. Like Whiggism should surely be dead at this point.
It seems like it, right? But this is the whole idea of freedom and submission. This is absolutely true. There is no such thing. There's no such thing as the truly autonomous self. And so, what's so funny is that if you look at sort of the best of boomer culture, which I don't think boomer culture is completely bankrupt, but I remember Bob Dylan's famous question of who are you going to serve? This is sort of a very classic understanding of freedom and slavery, that freedom has to be basically adherence to higher principle. Otherwise, it's just slavery to the self. I remember, actually, I don't know where I encountered this, but this is the one of my favorite movies of all time is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And I do believe it holds up. It's just a remarkable film. Have you ever seen it?
No.
It's with George Clooney. It's this wonderful retelling of the Odyssey by it's set in like 1930s America, Depression era America, with this criminal who escapes from a chain gang and tries to intercept his wife before she gets remarried. And he lies and says that he's there because he robbed the bank and hid the money, but he's actually in there for some minor infraction. He's just breaking out to try to break up this marriage, very much in the same way of the Iliad. But it starts with, of course, all the music is sort of very classic bluegrass, modern bluegrass renumberings of the original ones from the 30s. But the sort of trajectory of the character, he goes from sort of being enslaved in the chain gang, and he was put there because he was following sort of like very animal, petty lusts. And then it ends with him sort of leading his family, and he has the children sort of tied to each other with twine, and they're singing a hymn about journeying to heaven, right? And so it's sort of symbolic that he's exchanged the sort of ball and chain of the chain gang for another ball and chain, which is his family, right? He's constrained by his wife and his family and his loyalty to them. But at the same time, this is an earthly slavery for a heavenly one. And so that is, I think that's what people are looking for. That's the reason why we have this phenomenon of the branch Covidians, the people who keep up with this lockdown theater all the while everyone knows it's kind of a ridiculous farce. And it's because people understand that they need some kind of meaning and constraint, and they'll remanufacture that. And moreover, people understand that their supposed liberty and the kind of 1776 style is absolute bullshit.
Well, I was always surprised to read in Romans that the opposite of being a slave to sin, you would expect, having been brought up in as a good little liberal, that the opposite would be freedom in God. But it says, "Thanks be to God that you who were once slaves to sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching which you committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness." So it's kind of, you always have a master, and the best you can hope for is to move from a worse master to a better master, which we detest naturally. Not naturally. We, as having been indoctrinated into the idea of liberty as the highest concept, we want to be able to have full self-expression. But what does self-expression mean, if not moored to? So either you're going to chase hedonistic pleasure, in which case there's only one way to do it, which is following the path of least resistance and just gluttonously eating everything and having sex and whatever. or choosing the path of morality, in which again there's just one direction there, but a path that is much more spiritually fulfilling, but is nonetheless it's not freedom in that direction. This is the false dichotomy.
Now, once you acknowledge that the division between order and chaos or good and evil goes down the heart of man, then simply discussing an action as being free is pretty irrelevant. I mean, certainly the action, to borrow the previous analogy, the action of abandoning your wife and children to sort of go off and live an independent life. This is a path that a lot of people will recognize in sort of the boomer arc from the 70s, the man or the woman who leaves her family to rediscover themselves. This is an act of freedom, but the question is, where does this ultimately lead? And I don't think it, I guess there could be individual cases where this leads somewhere productive, but for the most part, this leads only back to self-indulgence and chaos, and to sort of feeding the elements of yourself that are easiest to satisfy. Because when two desires come up one against the other, you'll always pick the more self-indulgent one. If you're following the logic that you use to break the initial bond to its conclusion, that will inevitably be your way of approaching the problem. And so chaos sort of eats away at itself. You always take the more degraded step until you reach rock bottom. I think for the longest time, what had happened was that Western society had sort of culturally inculcated in people this preference for higher things implicitly as a cultural affectation. And so they would say, okay, well, when we cut these bonds formally, people won't want to just take drugs and live the most degraded lifestyle imaginable and have 37 sexual partners across a lifetime, because they've been taught through the movies and through the products they consume that this is just not done, that this is lower class. Their pride will sort of save them. But as we see, that this doesn't last. This lasts maybe for one generation. The baby boomers, you can tell that there's just some things that they don't do. They don't do this stuff. But the thing is, you see this certainly in the millennials and the Zoomers, like they have never been raised with these notions, and the culture they've consumed have told them the exact opposite. The best example of this is the transgenderism thing, especially when it comes to females in sports. You try to explain this to boomers. Like I come from a community with a lot of progressive boomers, and you explain to them that like now the rules, like the actual rules, allow transgender people in the sport, and there are people creating records that haven't taken any meaningful step to transition, but they'll say like, oh, it's just a one-off thing. This just happened to be this way, right? What they're relying on is some kind of like honor system, right? Like if you're not like they imagine, well, first of all, even if you did limit it to people who are physically transitioning their biology, it would still create problems, because the physical transition is not enough to make up for the initial gender or sex disadvantage. But even if even for people who they're taking they're basically relying on the honor system, that people aren't just going to cheat and say, right, no, identify as so and so, and what's really there. I mean, the only reason why we think that nobody can say I'm a woman if they're not physically trying to transition their body is because we have this leftover concept of a woman that means something biological. Once the word woman has no relation to biology, then anyone can say that they're a woman, and they don't even need to have any association with either the role or the biological feature. And you'll see this even in radical leftists. They always think that there's some kind of honor system that's going to bail them out. But these are simply, as Nietzsche would put it, these simply are the ghosts. These images, these honor systems, are simply the ghost of the dead god that they abandoned, and they're not going to last. And every generation is shocked when the honor system they propped up on the memory of the explicit morality is just ignored and done away with.
I wonder whether they're banking to some degree on their opposition being truthful. Like they can inflict damage because although they're prepared to lie and finagle the truth, they actually know that, for example, I would not put a fake made up gender down on a form to for just for expedience.
Yeah.
And so if they set up some sort of hierarchy of you get benefits for being oppressed in some way, and you eventually reaches a point where it's just impossible to live life without getting some kind of handout package. Their true opponents, the people who are the most virtuous and sort of self-supporting, are the ones who are going to suffer the most because they won't be able to lie.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's a good question because according to their own standards, they're not lying. The reason why you or I wouldn't, like, if we had some benefit where we would get like $50 for marking down women on a form, I wouldn't do it at this stage because the woman means something in the Christian language, which would be a lie. But
Yeah.
according to their language, it wouldn't even be a lie. All it would mean, because if you ask somebody who's a true progressive what woman means, the only thing that they'll say is being woman means that you identify as a woman. Like you just like the word. Well, I mean, that's fine. So, if you like the word because you get this benefit from it, then technically, according to their logic, you're not lying by putting it down. Like, I identify as a woman because I identify as a woman to get the $50 that is set aside for women. Like, I mean, that's actually not a lie. I mean, it's only a lie because the word resembles an element of Christian language. We're saying
Yes.
that would be a lie.
You're
And
sort
so
of equivocating over. Yes, I see what you mean. Okay, well, I'll keep that mental gymnastics in my back pocket for when I need it.
I'm not saying that we should play mental gymnastics. I will only say that they certainly will play mental gymnastics.
Yes.
And so I don't expect any honor to come from
Yeah.
future generations of progressive males or females on this regard because they don't respect these kind of boundaries. It kind of paradoxically, what it really is attacks. Is these kind of frames are attacks on people who think that words have eternal meaning and eternal consistency. The only problem is that if you don't believe that words have eternal meaning or eternal consistency, then none of your promises mean anything. Yeah, go ahead.
It is also kind of hilarious that the most extreme forms of pure feminism tried to abolish any sense of male and female difference whatsoever, to imply that there should be no difference in role, in appearance, in personality. And then transgenderism has kind of single-handedly resurrected every single one of those concepts because the people who transition need to be able to distinguish themselves. Their entire reason for transitioning was because they wanted to claim hold of those things that are distinct gender roles. So what had become androgynous has now become extremely gendered again, and
yeah. So
long hairdresses and makeup and everything, the whole list.
This is how you get to the progressive concept that lipstick is inherently feminine, but a cervix isn't.
Yes.
So I mean, like so presumably they're just two objects, right? A cervix and lipstick. And but lipstick has an essential female quality to it, and the cervix has a female quality to it in progressive theology that's only projected onto it by our emotions. And this is completely incoherent. There's no reason why this is the case. It actually contradicts their previous notions. But again, like the sort of trans people are actually just kidding themselves because they're banking. The reason why they like doing this, the reason why they like transitioning, is because of certain set asides and I'm not saying like get $50 if you mark woman on the form, like in our sort of ridiculous example. I'm saying that the reason why they identify as a woman is they want to occupy a social role that has been carved out for physical, biological human females due to the physical, biological constraints human females face as cervix owners. And
yes. Can we recover based gender roles by this means. We could say things like people who look like women belong in the kitchen. I'm not saying
Yeah,
women.
this is something that I this is obviously not going to happen, but I nonetheless think that this is an important thought experiment to kind of keep on the table, because I don't doubt there's going to be some individuals who make this transition. There is, you can imagine these sort of things like the based progressive victory, where progressives win in everything, and then they just implement reactionary policies. So you tell them that they've won, the feminists have won the sex war, and we're going to start going after men and forcing them to stay with and support the women that they
Yes.
impregnate.
We need
Just as feminists taught us
consent can only be properly, the only way to protect women is to have the whole of society involved in putting the contract together publicly before two people sleep together.
And you need to have like witnesses, and
Yes.
a monetary down payment in the form of precious metal. No fiat currency allowed, right? So you can do this. This is R.N. McIntyre said, is that it periodically feminists will reinvent healthy gender roles and say that they've discovered Atlantis. Like just they recently in Slate, they said that that their new thing was radical monogamy is the new thing the leftists have discovered. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And the thing is, it's again, this isn't going to happen on a large societal scale, but this will happen periodically, that there'll be a number of people who are going to look to basically physically connect with these more ancient principles, like actually follow these more ancient folkways, but they're going to be looking for sort of progressive excuses. This is sort of the Napoleonic route, where you basically, Napoleon re-implemented King Louis XIV, but just called it like revolutionary, right? That's basically what he did. I guess he included some elements of the revolution that were necessary. I can't imagine what those reforms would be from progressivism, but I'm sure there might be some. But other than that, he basically was ruled as a king, and he called himself revolutionary. And for a lot of people coming from progressivism, that's the only way they'll be able to justify healthy habits and healthy religion is convincing themselves that this is the end point of progressivism.
It also reminds me of the end of Animal Farm, when they looked from man to pig and couldn't tell one from the other. That the animal revolution had come full circle, and now the pigs had just become the new elite class, and the animals were still in subservience.
The thing is, I don't understand why it feels sort of like George Orwell is history's greatest misunderstander of his own work, because the cycle on Animal Farm is supposed to make you feel that it's supposed to make you feel that the revolution was betrayed and that the pigs are the great hypocrites and villains. But all it indicates is that there's sort of a natural order of things, that that farms will naturally be run in this hierarchy, and the revolutionary model is not a good model for mapping a good farm from a bad one, or demarcating a good farm from a bad one.
But wasn't Animal Farm meant to be an allegory for the Soviet Union? And I don't think Orwell was pro Lenin.
He was pro Trotsky, and there's a Trotskyist pig that I think his name is Snowball. So the implication is that if the Stalin pig, whose name Napoleon, didn't come to power, maybe things would have been different. I really doubt it. The form of the revolution necessitates that this needs to be able to basically consolidate power. Obviously, Orwell, being a sort of communist himself, leaves out the problems implicit with the entire revolutionary promise. Stalin couldn't keep control over the country without becoming Stalin, because the revolutionary logic would have justified his own execution. So if Stalin hadn't purged, then he would have been purged, and someone else who was purging would have come in and taken control, because there was no way to keep the empire in line except through using these extraordinary means. And anyone who didn't would have been victim to the person who did, because there was no promise the Soviet Union could make to itself that would be respected by somebody else who was revolutionary, who came in from behind. Because, for the revolutionary, the words themselves don't mean meaning. They just have, they're just sort of elements of a power struggle. And this is the crisis we're in too. I think also there's another delicious thing. I think O'Brien from 1984 is actually supposed to be James Burnham. Like I think James Burnham was a contemporary of Orwell, and in classic fashion, the idealist looks at the Machiavellian and thinks that because the Machiavellian is describing how things do work, he's describing how things ought to work.
Should, yes.
So he's sort of he's redrawn Burnham, I believe, as this satanic twister of the truth, right? This person who by believing the truth is relative and contextualized by power can make it thus.
I mean, that's kind of true of Machiavelli himself and his reputation. Like, Machiavellianism is a byword for most normal people for evil moustache twirling villain.
Absolutely.
Rather than just everybody who achieves anything in any context. Like, there's a reason it's called work politics. If you have ever considered whether a certain conversation might not be a good idea to have around your boss, you've been Machiavellian.
Well, Machiavellian is that's one of those dark triad personality traits where you see people as instrumental to your own rise to power. And it's a personality trait that I have many personality flaws. I don't think that's one of them. I tend to try to see the best in everyone, even if they're radical centrists. But
to a fault.
But the thing is, we're just talking about sort of political realism in a chaotic vacuum. Then I'm afraid that's the case. I think, to get back on the topic of our stream, the thing that's lacking with Big Brother and the thing that's lacking in revolutions is religion. And the central thing is that there's a very limited amount of power that you can exert over a ruler, except in comparison to sort of what we might consider a mandate of heaven, some kind of eternal bond or pact or word that the ruler has to live by. And there has to be a few things that this pact or bond takes into consideration. It has to be something that society understands is eternal. Like, power can't move this. A revolution can't unseat this. This is just the eternal way things. The revolution can't unseat this, because if the revolution can unseat the standards for the mandate of heaven, then the ruler can essentially abolish the standard by which he's judged by, right? And the other thing is that everyone in society has to believe it. And the ruler has to publicly profess it, and it's better if the ruler believes it himself. So there, in neo-reactionary circles, there's a sort of ridiculous concept. Curtis Yarvin's guilty of this. He constantly compares what would be needed for a Caesar to like a CEO of a company. So CEOs are absolute dictators of companies, and they're answerable to the board. And the board is kind of like the representatives of the people. And companies work pretty effectively most of the time. There are corrupt CEOs, but there's mechanisms to get rid of them, obviously, through the board of directors. And the question that Yarvin poses is, well, okay, so if it's so easy to get rid of bad CEOs, and CEOs ruling top down are so effective, well, then why isn't this a better model for government than is government, like the way we run it right now, either through dictatorship or through democracy? And Yarvin's answer is, well, this is partially true. His answer is that it's the top-down nature of the CEO that makes him more efficient. And that's partially true. But he's leaving out the main, controlling mechanism. Why is a CEO so easy to remove if he's doing a bad job? The board of directors, sure, right? But what do all the board of directors have in common? That modern rulers, they have a common objective. The point of the company is to make money, right? And everyone knows if you're not making money, right?
Right.
So if
Yes.
you're not making money, you can't decide if the question over whether the company's goal was to make money or not. Bad CEOs would be much harder to identify,
Yes.
right? Because like, well,
Yes.
maybe we're not supposed to be making money. Maybe we're supposed to be doing something else, right? Like promoting LGBTQ rights or whatever. And if that were the case, then bad CEOs would be almost impossible to eliminate because you could constantly switch up the standard. The
Hmm.
reason why that even monarchy seems impossible right now is that you couldn't imagine a board of directors ruling over them because the standards by which a monarch would be considered good or bad would be constantly changing because our society has no constant concept of good or bad. It only has a constant concept of good or bad because of a common religious moral framework.
Hmm.
If a society of Christians or Chinese people came together, or not, I mean, Chinese Confucians, so a society of Christians and a society of Chinese Confucians, each of those two respective societies could decide whether a ruler had violated the mandate of heaven or whether he was doing an adequate job. But mix the two together, and you have a big problem on your hands because it would be much more difficult coming up with what the mandate of heaven even is because the views of heaven are entirely different.
I guess the theory of secularism implies that you can have a morality. It either means that you can have a morality that all of the potential religions within the country would agree to, some sort of atheistic ethic, or that actually you can run a country without needing to answer ethical questions, which
Yeah.
both of which seem obviously stupid on their face, and yet it is the kind of unquestioned assumption of almost everybody in the West.
Yeah, the countries, in my opinion, only exist based on common ethical frameworks. The example I always use is the example of the country that my grandmother was born into, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Hmm.
Now, this was a multi-ethnic empire, but there were two kinds of minorities in it. So there are minorities like the German, Danish Swabians, and the Hungarians. They're almost not minorities. The Hungarians were so much a part of the empire that they literally had to rename the empire to include them in it. But these minorities were sort of moral stakeholders. They were adherents to the state religion and the state ethos, and so they were sort of full citizens. And then there were other minorities. I don't know if I can say this minority on YouTube. There were also, people
Were they
of a
Ashkenazi?
Talmudic persuasion, I should say,
Yeah.
that these minorities had a harder time because their religion was very similar to the Catholicism that ruled in the empire, but they could never get away from the fact that, not being adherents of the religion, their opinions on whether somebody was acting in the proper moral framework were really quite secondary. And even when going to the minorities that eventually brought the empire down, the sort of Slavic Orthodox minorities further to the east, uh, these um, these minorities were incredibly similar to the Catholic moral view, but just by virtue of them being nominally on the outside of that arrangement, made it so they were constantly aware of the fact that they were not proper stakeholders in this empire. The empire was operating with them as a problem and not as something they'd want to push forward. Very few Hungarians thought that they were a problem minority in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, maybe they thought that they needed, a little bit more control over this area or not, but they were stakeholders. The other minorities, Talmudic or Orthodox, did not believe that that was the case and felt very disenfranchised because of that.
Now the truth is, of course, the countries that declare themselves secular, such as the United States, aren't secular in slightest because they have a religion that they're following to a T, and that religion just happens to be sort of morphing at the moment, and you might say progressing, depending on your point of view, and it has all of the normal characteristics that might make you think something is religious.
Mhm.
Dress code,
Ceremony.
services, prayers, priests. So yeah,
Now everyone
and
has a DEI officer, a DEI officer
yes,
in their workplace. It's really creepy, and all public events now they're introducing. Have you heard? Do you? I guess you can't do this in England, but do you know what a land acknowledgement is?
I've
I
heard
wonder
about
if
these.
you've seen this. This is something that they do. Every ceremony I've been to in Canada has done this, with the exception of the Catholic ones.
Yeah,
And increasingly, this is
that's
coming
crazy.
down the West Coast, and
That's
it's
crazy.
where before you do anything, before you have any public event, you acknowledge that the event is being held on the rightful land of the Native American people.
Do you
And
think
this is
there's
it's just something that you say. It doesn't have anything to do with the event you're running or anything. It's just you have to say this as an opening to whatever else you're doing.
there's bits of London that they probably should do that in. We acknowledge that this land was once owned by the, the white native population.
I thought you were going to go. This was Celtic land expropriated by the Anglo Saxons, and
No,
500. But yeah, I guess you could do. This is the native land of the Anglo Saxons,
yeah,
the proud South Londoners. You know,
I mean it does seem particularly ridiculous on these Fair Isles to talk about the indigenous population having some rights to the land when we've been invaded like clockwork for like 1,000 years by a different group. Every, oh, here come the Saxons. Oh, here come the Angles. Oh, here come
yeah,
the Normans. And
you
okay,
have a good number of invasions, but I would say that the genetic character probably was pretty stable post 700 AD in England. Maybe with some areas getting some Viking blood, but I think the Normans, they were a ruling class, but I don't think they really repopulated the country or anything.
I couldn't tell you. I was under the impression that there was significant Norman genetic material amongst the British population, but maybe that's a misconception on my part.
It would be hard because Normans were essentially Christianized. What do you say? How do you can't say? What's the equivalent of anglicized for French? Francicized. They were
Yeah,
Christianized,
probably.
Francicized Vikings, basically. And the Vikings had spent the last 100, 200 years raping their way up and down the British coasts. So
Okay,
I would say that there probably would be more genetic material from Eric the Red than William the Conqueror, but it's
interesting.
since it's very similar genetic material, you know,
You wouldn't be able to disentangle
yeah,
anyway.
I don't think you'd be able to disentangle it because the division is only a few hundred years and a religious conversion that separates them.
Yeah. Did you ever buy into the concept of secularism?
Oh yeah. I spent most of my 20s as a progressive. I mean, even
Uh-huh.
when people make fun of me of this, but like I was when I started the channel, I had this conversation with Argent Templar. That was the first live stream I ever did. And I was I have my views haven't really changed very much since then, other than becoming more realist and cynical. But my values hadn't changed. And so I was a Catholic, still I'm a Catholic, still believe everything. I'm still a big fan of John Paul II. But back then, I believed John Paul II not only as a religious holy man, but also as sort of a prophet for how to fix liberalism. This is sort of the
Mm,
first. Have you ever heard the
interesting.
magazine First Things?
Yeah.
This founded by this priest John Newhouse, who is this conservative. So Martin Luther King had a bunch of religiously conservative allies in the original early 1960s marches, and this priest was one of them. But he split off from the movement when it sort of went down the more progressive, to become progressivism as we've known it post 1970s, and he created these conservative offshoots of Catholicism, and their idea, and this is very much, I don't think it was influenced, I think it's very much in keeping with John Paul II's idea, was that you would essentially have a liberalism that was grounded in sort of traditional, strong Christianity or Catholicism. And we would have these sort of boundaries that we would erect. Liberalism would go here, and the church would go here, and they wouldn't interfere with each other. And this was since John Paul II was somebody who was very much, I mean, he was very much a conservative. He was a conservative supporter of Vatican II, and he was very much somebody who admired the West, being a Pole. He imagined very much this sort of, it's almost like a Reaganite compromise for Christianity, saying something like, "Oh yeah, no, we're going to modernize Christianity, but we're going to keep all of its core principles vivified and at their full strength. We're not going to retreat an inch on our principles, but we're going to sort of give unto Caesar what is Caesar's." And society can secularize, but society, being prudent and rational, knows that they need us, so that we're going to mutually support each other. And this is obviously, I think that the first crack in the Catholic Church was the abuse scandals that showed that the church had a bunch of unhealthy components to it. But the second thing is that there was just no normalcy that the secular progressive worldview would accept. They constantly attacked core elements of the faith and core elements of normalcy that would be needed for any kind of division in the way that sort of John Paul II people imagined it. But still, up to 2016, you can see on my channel, I say something like, I'm a convinced liberal. I'm a convinced liberal. And what I meant by that is we can fix it. We can fix liberalism. We just need to get religion back in the picture. We need to make these reforms. We need to limit immigration. We need to increase pronatalism. And it's the kind of things like Adam and Sitch ask me, like, what do you advocate for? And I tell them the sort of the fixes you could hypothetically do inside liberalism to fix the system. And they get angry at me because when they point out that no one will do those things, and I agree with them, they get angry at me because they think I'm bullshitting them. But what can I tell you? Like, you could turn, if you had control over the government, you could turn the ship around. No one's going to do that because that's not how the path of history works. There's nothing stopping John Paul II's ideology from fixing everything. There's nothing stopping the ideas of Roger Scruton. Like, Sargon is right now, he's basically a Roger Scruton channel, right? Like, that's his ideology. I don't know if he calls himself a conservative, but he is basically a Roger Scruton conservative. I'm sorry, you might hear my kid in the background. But there's something like hypothetically, and just like there's something stopping cold fusion from being a reality, there's something stopping, like in the laws of physics, there's something stopping cold fusion from being done, and there's something in the laws of physics, the political physics, to stop liberalism from fixing all its problems and working. Just on a practical appraisal of how political opinion moves inside democracies, no one's ever going to do those things because there's no benefit from pushing those buttons, right?
And this is the problem, because it makes the liberal project as utopian as socialism. Because yes, if everybody was prepared to act selflessly, we could have a beautiful society. And yes, if you could ignore the realities of politics, you could run this society. But we live in the real world.
Yeah,
this is the map, right? We are here and we want to get to our destination. We need to know what mountains are in the way. So you can't just ignore human sinfulness and human nature. You can't just ignore the way that power operates in the world. The solutions that are worth discussing are the ones that could actually be implemented.
People are joking that there's an exorcism going on in my house. It's just bath time in the background. We live in an apartment, so that's just how it goes. I'm going to mute myself. I guess the problem is that it's sort of like, obviously everyone knows that you can't have a utopia by all men being angels. What's so infuriatingly tantalizing about the John Paul II Roger Scruton solution is that just 50 or 60 years ago, we could do these solutions. but
Interesting.
but because our moral system has degraded so much, and because our intellectual class has degraded so much, they don't have the priorities, and we don't have the will to do these things. And so solutions that would be possible only a few decades ago, or maybe half a century ago, now are just permanently out of reach, and we just have to talk about radically different things.
I remember being taught in school that there was this Christian. I mean, this was not a Christian school, and they taught us that some Christians viewed it that they could separate religion and politics. So they'd have religion in private in their home, and they'd go to church, or whatever. And then when it came to making decisions, there was just absolutely no connection between them. And then the opposite opinion to this was portrayed as some sort of medieval theocracy horror. That was how we were taught to think. And it feels like this was almost a perfect, ingenious pincer movement that's happened, because suppose they started pushing that kind of secular vision, as you say, 50 or 60 years ago, and now they're pivoting and they're throwing away secularism because they've had enough time at this point that secularism has dispensed with all of the positive moral visions that Christianity gave us. And now they can say, oh, well, of course, liberalism doesn't give us enough of a moral foundation, so let us now install our new set of moral values. Now that we've completely cleared out every remnant of Western Christianity from the state, but now we can implement, onto a tabula rasa. We've you see what I mean about it? It's
Like most
misperceptions.
precision. Like most, this starts with the kernel of truth, which is that in the West, the king and his church were always separate entities. And you can see this even in Dante. He's basically this cuck Guelph. So there are two parties in medieval Italy, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And Dante was a Guelph, but he was a secret Ghibelline. And he was very much of the opinion that there were sort of two mandates to rule Europe, one from Rome and one from Christ. Essentially, the way he would put it is that Christ gave two mandates, one to the church and one to Rome. And obviously, this is a little theologically dodgy, but I think that you'll trace this tradition throughout Christendom, which is that the idea that church and the king are separate is something that's consistent throughout how we've operated, how we've chose to operate. And this is something that I think there's a critical dimension to this. It's sort of like you want the board of directors and CEO to be separate, but the idea that there's the politics and religion are separate. I think that's sort of taking this to a ridiculous conclusion, to the point where you can't even have religion comment on the things that politics do.
Well, I think the error is that you need religion to be above politics. I think the way that it was conceived of in the Old Testament for Israel was that the priest was considered to be above the king. Like Saul gets basically removed from his throne by Samuel, who then says, right, David's the real king.
And he loses the mandate of heaven. I don't think they use those words, but they actually, in some translations, they might have used those words, to be honest. But that's what literally is happening across the Book of Kings, is that people are losing the ability or the rightfulness of ruling through the pronouncements of the religious figures themselves. And this is the interplay that naturally goes on. The thing is right now is that a lot of people in the distant right circle they're really counting on this whole Caesarism thing. And the Caesarism thing is this idea that, we're in the secular civilization where our own Brahmin class, our own priests are so weak, and our republic is so weak that a Caesar needs to come in and just prevent chaos from happening. I don't think that as Spengler put it, Faustian man, or what he really meant by that, European Christian man, I don't think that type of person, that civilization will ever accept a king that is not an extension of the religious apparatus. I think we're going to go straight to disintegration. I don't think we're going to have a Caesarean step in this process. And that is because Caesar, like he basically he turns the Senate, which is a religious office, into a lie. And so the Flavian emperors, they rule a stable Roman Empire for hundreds of years under the full knowledge that the religion that they're following is just bullshit, is just untrue. Everything about the Christian civilization that came afterwards is designed to reject that arrangement. And it's not surprising that the early Christians came into conflict with the Flavian emperors and the Judeo-Claudian emperors before them. I don't think that post-Christian man who is still Christian in his soul is ever going to accept the kingship, even if it means more wealth and stability for him, under the pretense of a religious lie. I think that we're going to skip right to chaos and then the establishment of new religious principles, and that's the contest that we have before us. And I don't think there can be any intermediate. I say that like, oh, I would prefer, maybe I prefer a king right now if it meant that we wouldn't have war and chaos and transition 5-year-olds and people put on HRT. That's absolutely a true statement. But I don't think that that's going to happen, because I don't think that the kind of culture we are is ever going to accept authority on the basis of a lie. We're going to have the mandate of heaven and the king that rules with divine ordination, or we will have a republic of moral Christians, or we will have chaos. And those are the only three options, right?
I guess the question in some ways is the current situation as bad as we're making out, or are we just... So, for example, would you rather live with your neighbors transitioning their 5-year-old, or in the middle of the Red Terror in Soviet Russia?
Well, the Red Terror, I guess, would be something that's literally breaking down my door. The thing is I don't think that those two are mutually exclusive, because I think that any situation where you have I said this to Adam and Sitch, the problem isn't just that people are transitioning their 5-year-olds. The real problem for society, the iceberg that's on our horizon, is that basically most of our ruling class and a large chunk of our non-ruling class thinks that if you don't educate and make available transitioning to 8-year-olds, then that's child abuse. And the other, like 6% of the country, believes that doing that is child abuse. So it's completely black and white, right? Like one person thinks that A is child abuse, and one person thinks that not A is child abuse. And so there's no way you can coexist these religions, because they're no matter who's ruling, they're both going to be coming for the kids. And both sides will see the kids as worth something to fight over. And so the problem is that this type of religious divergence is going to necessitate some form of heavy-handed totalitarian response. And I don't see any way around this unless, obviously, unless one side loses, but we all know what side has to lose. Because if the progressive side wins, as it usually does, all it's going to do is iterate and eat its children, and it's going to remanufacture the same crisis at a different level. This time with more degraded birth rates, more instability, because it's going to have to ship in more people from the third world, and so on and so on and so on. The only path to stability is a quote-unquote right-wing victory, which seems, practically speaking, at this moment, almost impossible.
I tend to agree. I've never heard anyone put forward a possible future that seemed plausible, other than the collapse in the short or medium term of the entire West. Everything else seems like fantasy. I mean, I suppose with the one exception of genuinely miraculous sort of regenerative spiritual movement from the bottom up caused by God, which I can't discount that possibility. But
it's hard to imagine, though, isn't it? Although in America,
it's not plausible in human terms. It's just the additional factor that God could act in unforeseen ways.
The problem is that we're just like very far away from one of the spontaneous movement. Those movements do happen in history, but we're so far away from them, it's hard to imagine that happening in modern time. And I guess that in America, the what seems like the obvious path, and I don't think this is replicable in the continent or in whatever the British Isles, the continent of Europe or the British Isles, and the path that America is going to be on is slow decline, with people exerting more and more local control de facto, but not de jure. So people will pass laws and people just ignore them. And this will actually get easier as the federal government gets more paranoid and passes impossible to follow laws, because then everyone will just be in violation and the government won't have the energy to track down everyone. I've heard some people say that information technology means that tracking everyone is suddenly possible. And, so we're going to literally enter the Orwell pink police state. It'll be the pink terror as opposed to the red terror. But I don't think that we're there in America. I think because of the space involved, it's a harder sell.
I increasingly think that the claims of the competence of government to build incredibly sophisticated digital systems are overstated. I'll put it that way. Like the fact that we still have to talk about boots on the ground rather than drones is quite comforting, because to some degree it means that they're still facing the same old material realities that they always were. You have to persuade people to take part in large scale action. You have to. So there's some reasons for hope, but it's overall very grim. That's one of the reasons I loved your Fox in the Snow stream so much. That we are facing what looks like pretty inevitably bleak conditions, but framed from a certain perspective. There's a coziness to finding shelter in the middle of that, and I think that's really important. That just because our analysis is bleak doesn't mean that we have to be individually bleak.
Absolutely,
right. The story of your life can still be one of moving in an entirely positive direction. You can improve yourself throughout your life, no matter how degenerate things are becoming around you, and you can improve your community and make it a more wholesome, positive, wonderful, loving place, no matter how angry and selfish and deracinated your neighbors become.
The real challenge, I think that was very beautifully put, and this is absolutely where I'm thinking, is that you look at the whole parasocial thing in 2016, 2017, and 2018, the right wing or the distance, they caught a brief moment of prominence inside this sphere of social media. And the result was just, I mean, I think we did get people to believe a lot of righteous things that would be beneficial to their own lives. But insofar as it came down to the making content at that time, what you're looking at is this a flurry of absolute chaos and something that ultimately came to nothing, because all of the social media clout that was built on those platforms was just nuked from orbit when the cathedral got its shit together and decided that this was a serious problem for them, and they didn't want some kind of massive counter-signaling campaign when it came to the 2020 elections. And this basically ended any kind of real interest I could derive from political conversations online. If you look at them now, from my point of view, they're boring.
Yes.
But at the same time, retreating and going more into your own community it feels more wholesome. It feels like people actually learn more things. The only real challenge for us as content creators, and I still don't exactly know how to answer this question, is what are we doing? What are the metrics for our success? Obviously, the number one metric for my success is that I help people learn things and keep their morale up and work through problems that I've worked through faster so that they save themselves time. And that's hopefully what I want to give to my audience. The thing is obviously, if you look at any of these political streamers like not Destiny because he was consumed by his own revolution, but Vosh and Demon Mama and Xander Hall, he's been in the buzz recently, or even Adam and Sitch, their whole brand is their own buzz. The reason why it's funny and fun is that everyone is laughing at the same thing, and it feels like you're part of this big deal and you're going to overpower people. You're part of a group, you're part of a mob. Our ability to procure that in any kind of healthy way is very limited. And moreover, and so in lacking that, I think the question is, how can we best serve the community and what are our next steps? There might indeed, there might be with this whole Elon Musk buying Twitter thing. This does create, there's this very interesting fork in the road at this stage, right? Because, what could happen is that Twitter either could go down in a ball of flames or become radically decentered from the cathedral. And this would probably create another 2 to 3 years period where there would be the devil's playground and the right could come out and try to get clout again. And it gives me an ulcer just thinking about that. But this
I wouldn't worry
be,
too, but I don't think that's
obviously it would eventually get crushed. But the question is, if that little flicker were to happen again, how would you use it as a right winger or as a non-progressive? Yes. And that's not so clear to me. Obviously, I would like to think that we learned something from the initial eruption between 2016 and 2019. And we could actually do something more productive and more life-giving. In my opinion, you always want to build deeper and at a spiritual level first, and then at a popular or quantitative level second. This is why periodically I have people on my Telegram coming on and complaining how I de-emphasize race. The thing is kind of, in my opinion, ridiculous, because using race, although race is important and it will always be important, using it as an organizing principle creates the exact wrong situations. It creates situations where it's a mass popular movement and there's no ethical standards. It's just will to power. And it creates a situation where the worst possible people, through social media clout, basically shove the best people into a corner and do so for the worst possible reasons. Any worthwhile movement has to have an ethical focus and has to have a spiritual foundation, an ethical focus, and has to focus on making people better, produce better art, have better spiritual lives, actually create families and settle down and create lives that are worth living and communities that have some substance to them. I would say that we're still figuring this out. We're still feeling around in the dark because of the internet. The distances involved make it very difficult for this community to consistently meet on anything more than like a yearly or maybe 2 or 3 times a year basis. But we have to be thinking about moving in this direction.
Yes, it's a project that's ongoing. I don't know if I have the best view of it, but it does feel like the growing numbers mean that there's higher density. Maybe I'm wrong and the numbers aren't growing, but it seems like there's still growth in this community going on, meaning that the traveling problems might reduce just because there's literally enough people to make a more local gathering work.
Well, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Like, I've been doing this for longer than you have. So like my growth as this channel goes is obviously it was slow in the beginning, but but when it gets to like 2018, like I take a huge growth up and I go from 10,000 to 20,000.
Okay.
And then, my views don't go down. My views go up, but my growth goes down. And it's really easy to see this
Interesting.
because you go to the tab, and before 2018, or before 2019, I should say, you could see like people who are subscribed to your channel who are clicking on it versus people who aren't. And before 2019, it's like most people who are looking aren't subscribed. They're new viewers. Whereas afterwards, it's people who are subscribed that are viewing my channel. And so
Interesting.
and so the growth is happening. The growth is occurring. But it's occurring at a much slower rate than it was in those sort of 3 years of absolute insanity.
Yes, that's been my observation because I started my channel only like a year and a half ago, and it's pretty clear that all of the growth is done by legwork rather than by algorithm, right?
Yeah.
It's everybody involved can tell you they know about your channel because they heard you tell them to go and look at it directly on somebody else's live stream.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Like, we don't expect a hand up from our enemy at this point. Like, in some ways, it was lovely that they gave a bit of a boost for 3 years and then noticed what was going on. But the numbers, I think, shouldn't, like you were saying, what's the metric? And in some ways, it's so easy to get dragged off into numberland. But to channel Carlyle, the things that matter in life can't be quantified. And actually, the things that we should be aiming for as content creators are probably not numeric in any sense. I think we should be. I think we should be aiming to be somehow qualitatively more real, less based on fear, more based on hope. Things like this. Like the metrics should be around focusing on spirituality more than materiality. Everything about our communities should be about a positive and exciting vision based on the individual controllable things that go on within the hearts of the people listening, to the point where if I'm a creator and I only have one person listening, it's still worth my time to speak.
Yeah. That's actually an excellent. Yeah, if you're a creator and you have a live stream and one person is listening to you, and that one person is a community member you recognize, like I recognize a lot of the people in your chat as people who watch my channel as well. If there's just one person watching, it's still worth it to communicate to them because the people are important. I guess the problem is, and this is something that we're going to have to discuss, is this is sort of the perfect place for intellectualism, but the difficulty is that spirituality has to be embodied in order to be real. And
yes,
so whereas
yes.
Bible studies work fairly well online, I've never seen prayer groups work nearly as well.
True.
And obviously the whole this whole last 2 years with the online celebration of the masses, from a Catholic point of view, just instinctively, I'm not going to say that the church is wrong and it's not holy and that you shouldn't go to online mass as a replacement, and that this isn't sort of necessary, but mass not being physically a physical event is fundamentally not mass. Mass is a physical event, and it physically is done with your body.
Yeah.
And prayer is physically done with your body. And it, I'm not, there probably is something to be said for having prayer going on in the background of a live stream while you're doing something. Maybe there's something to be said for that, but that is not the same thing as praying and
with people in person.
Yeah. And so this is, and I think the frustration with the problems of growth is everyone knows we're growing, but growing slowly. But there is the thing is that we would, in order to get the sort of regularity of in real life events to where it needs to be, we would need to have like 10 times the amount of people, or
Wow.
one or two orders of magnitude. And that's going to take a while to build up. And it's going to be, it's going to be made more difficult by the fact that the social media landscape is going to be shifting from under our feet. I think that the solution is just going to be legwork. Ultimately, it's going to be making the right kinds of connections. It's going to be, this is why I think what you're doing right now, or have done, I think I might be the last one. And
Yeah.
what Millennial Woes
Yeah.
did before you. The reason why this is so important is, now through Millennial Woes, I have connection to everyone who is on Millennial, and I'm not of one mind with all of those people. As a matter of fact, my channel has made a point of criticizing a lot of their ideas, especially around the kind of race worship stuff that you see in some circles. And but still, like that network is important to have intellectually, and it's important to have a record of that. From this event of Lamster, or
Yes.
I like Easter
Yes.
Lambda, but that's too verbose. But from this event, now we have a jumping off point where you can see the form of the community. All the people who you have on are part of a community of people who participated in Lamster. And this creates the record. This creates a directory you can go back through and see who the allies are. And if you paired frequent festivals with regular in real life events with a consistent directory, which I know Charlemagne's working on, right? If all of these things were, they'd have to be permanent somewhere. But if all these things were permanent and regular, this would create a substructure through which more permanent things could grow, because you could have deeper relationships being built.
And those things would probably become targets, and every imaginable type of method to close them down will be attempted. I mean, what you said
for
about
sure.
the like preventing real life meetups. There was a period in this country during the lockdowns when it was illegal to have people over to your private house to visit you.
Oh my God, yeah.
It was illegal to go to church. They literally stopped, which my opinion is, so many churches dropped the ball on that one. It is a literal command in the Bible to meet together regularly.
Yeah.
Like that, you cannot claim that joining a Zoom meeting with your small group is a fair, following of that commandment. So I think we need to be much better prepared for either overt or covert, or probably both in a thoughtful, prayerful way. Law breaking. Hello, Susan. so,
Well, I think
or-
that the events are instructive. Like, there was an academic agent who said the Iosaurus always goes towards the group, the organization, the network. There's a reason why the first cathedral pushback was the Data and Society report by what's her face, and all she did was she just cross-referenced the directory of people who met on live streams. And did this little network diagram that showed how they were all connected by the amount of times they'd appeared together. And because that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid of a perpetual network of people who are connected. And this is the thing is that I do encourage people to sort of further subdivide into areas of interest, because I think that at some point, you can have Lamster with 100 people, but you're not going to have a Lamster with 1,000 people,
right.
or a millennial. So at some point, what's going to happen is that there will be certain divisions and certain fragmentations.
Yes.
But that will just be a healthy sign of growth. And there'll be
ultimately,
go-betweens, right?
It's likely that if I do Lamster again, I might have some people on who are more aligned with me in terms of their Christian thinking and more weakly aligned with the wider group politically. And whereas, I don't know, Millennial Woes, perhaps he'd have some slightly different leaning in who he chooses as his guests, and you end up, because it's spreading, no longer can you just assume that everybody involved is guilty, because the spreading effect gets so broad and weakly. Oh, did you meet for board games with the guy who was once on a live stream with a guy who was in the Telegram chat with Distributist? That's too many links. So
I actually really liked your board game streams because they illustrated like a very healthy. Sometimes I think that Zoomers just need to have, like, this is a little bit obscene, but you know how pandas don't mate in captivity unless they are visually shown videos of pandas mating in captivity. I feel like
you're saying people like autistic nerds who watch us don't know how to have fun unless they watch.
I'm actually kind of wondering if that's the case, that they need to. This is what a board game night looks like. This is what like a dinner party looks like. There's this movie called Dinner with Andre, and I almost feel like that there. At one point, I wanted to just have like a dinner party, like a normal dinner party, and just cut it together and just publish it as a movie and go, this is what ordinary normal people do. It's like that blogger Alex Kashuta said, she just wants to scream at the top of her lungs, just be normal, just be normal. Right? Because the generation that the Zoomers and whatever we call them, the Alephists, the Alphas, they have no understanding of what normalcy is, and they have a hard time trying to model that. Even after COVID, it's particularly like asking 20 people to come over for a board game night is like now a radical activity.
Right.
What?
Mad. But by the way, people in chat seem to have misunderstood. I wasn't saying I was going to reduce my guest list down to only people who agree with me on my Christian views. I was saying I would expand my guest list to include some people who were less politically engaged than the people who joined in for this, perhaps. Just as an example of how, because the idea I was pushing towards was soften the edges of the community so you become a more difficult target, right? It's like any other camouflage. You need to make yourself kind of amorphous and shapeless and difficult to pin down, so that somebody can't come in and simply say, do a straightforward network analysis and there you go, found them all. You want to have you want to have these links being, you want it to take as much time to figure out the links as it would take for us to radicalize a Fed.
Well, exactly. And, this is the thing, and this is what Aaron McIntyre has done. I think is yeoman's work at doing. He's sort of been the star of 2021, in my opinion, more than anyone else. And he's sort of succeeded on Twitter. And, I actually killed my Twitter account the very same time as Aaron McIntyre's exploded. And I was pretty
suspicious.
Yeah. Well, I was actually successful at Twitter to a certain extent. But Satan was whispering to me, "Oh wow, you could have had that prominence if you hadn't destroyed your Twitter account." Best decision in my life to destroy my Twitter account. It markedly increased my concentration and my focus on my family. So I'm no looking back on that regard. The second thing is Aaron McIntyre is just definitively better at Twitter than I am. He has a succinctness that I never had. And, even though we are of one mind ideologically, Twitter is not a game about writing a 20 tweet, essay in tweet form that a lot of people like. It's about that one tweet. It's not rocket science. They're just coming for kids, retweeted and retweeted and retweeted again and again and again in meme form. And I hate that kind of stuff. So
it's not why neocameralism is dangerous for our children. 1 out of 20.
Yeah, that's the typical. That's the Twitter thread from the Distributist that had limited amount of success in 2019. But what Aaron McIntyre's real, obviously, eventually Aaron's going to get banned from Twitter, and it'll be very sad. And unfortunately for him, and this is also very sad. Unlike Odyssey, you can, if you get banned from YouTube and you're a good YouTuber, your Odyssey career is just going to be the same as your YouTube career with the volume turned down. You can't do the same thing on Twitter as you do on Gab or anything, because the cloud isn't the same, the repetition isn't the same. Twitter's utility is the volume. But that being said, there will be one eternal contribution of Aaron McIntyre, and that is that I think Aaron McIntyre, this is his eternal contribution that will last even after his inevitable ban from Twitter, and that is that he has bridged, and in a way that a lot of people thought was impossible, he has bridge the gap between the normie conservative and in America, the American normie conservative, and the neo-reactionary. And this is something that you discover when you talk. I had a priest friend on, and like from my in real life community, on my channel. Oh God, a few months ago, and it was interesting because you talk to these people and you're expecting there to be a lot more division. There is, in terms of the implications, the ultimate view of where we are in a historical fashion. But their understanding that something is deeply wrong, that our values need to be communicated in a radically new way, that stuff's all the same. What you see when you talk to normies is people who feel that, rightly so, that they are in a position of power and responsibility where they can't be edgy. But they're saying the same things we have. They're looking at the same dark implications of 2022 that we have. They're living through the same winter we are, and so building those relationships with the disaffected normie conservatives, that's absolutely essential, because the cathedral is going to have a hard time cutting off 30% of the population and having that be meaningful in any way.
Well, I hate to bring this stream and indeed all of Lambster to an end, but I feel like that's also a great place to maybe call it.
All right.
I would like to say thank you to both you and all the rest of my guests for making Lambster an absolutely amazing success. I was slightly perturbed to see, because I'm running this thing on my second channel, and there's more people now subscribed to this than my Bible study channel. So on the off chance that somebody's watching this and isn't subscribed to Lambda Bible Studies, do go and check that out, because I really care about that project.
I agree with that. That's a great little. I've watched a few of those, and yeah, it's difficult, but it's difficult because it's this in real activity that's digitalized, but it's actually very good. I recommend people watch it.
Thank you very much. Oh, you should come on sometime as well.
Oh, I would love to, actually. Yeah, and it's also
amazing.
The Lambster Bible study, might actually be a good example of just teaching Zoomers how to be normal, as Alex Kashuda. Right. We should just call it Kashuda-ing the Zoomer generation.
Yes.
That should be the meme, that this Alex Kashuda saying, "Just be normal, damn it." but if you need to, modeling how ordinary people do Bible studies, which is something that doing a Christian reading group, I highly recommended. It was one of performing it for several years at my own church was just an amazing experience. And it's just really not right to read ancient texts. It's very difficult for lay people to read any ancient texts outside of a group, and reading it in a group is just so much more important. And so, if you can't do it yourself, Lambda Bible Studies is a very good way to Kashuda yourself into understanding how to do it in your own life.
What a wonderful plug. Thank you very much. And now to close it all out, I'm going to read the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, the Great Commission. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age.